Cherokee 214 Tango, inbound on the ILS.
214 Tango, Tower, good evening, runway 24, clear to land.
Good evening, Brandon. And what I mean to say is clear to land 24, good evening, Brandon.
How you doing?
Welcome back. Happy New Year 2020. You know, it's the beginning of a new year and even a new decade, and hopefully the beginning of a new era for a certain aerospace company we all know that starts with a B. I'm Brandon Gonzales. This is Podcasting on a Plane, and this is your aviation audio magazine. We hit aviation from as many angles as possible, and my favorite two angles are from the cockpit and from the tower. That's because I'm an air traffic tower controller at a busy GA airport, but I'm also a pilot, and I specialize in high-performance transition training and mentoring pilots into the complex world of our national airspace system. Or to put it more simply, I'm the one you call if you're a GA pilot and you want to level up your game both in the plane and, of course, on the radios. On this podcast, we share stories, news, and experiences that help you love aviation even more. But sometimes it's a little hard, like when you love something that seems to have lost its way. You want it to be great again, but the road to recovery is long and arduous, and as much as you want to help, there's just little you can do to really affect its outcome. Yeah, we're talking about Boeing again today. And I've compiled a few really good news articles about where things stand. And make sure to stay all the way to the end, because the final article is probably my favorite article of 2019 about really anything. And it answers the one true question we've all been asking. But first, the biggest news that surprised no one. From CNBC.com on December 23rd, Boeing fires CEO Dennis Muilenburg as the company struggles with 737 MAX crisis. This article by Leslie Josephs and Emilio Lucas. Boeing ousted CEO Dennis Muilenburg, saying Monday that it replaced him with the company's chairman as the nation's biggest manufacturing exporter struggles to regain the trust of regulators and customers and the public in the wake of two fatal crashes of its best-selling plane, the 737 MAX. Muilenburg stepped down immediately, and Chairman David Calhoun, age 62, will become CEO on January 13th. Boeing declined to comment on Muilenburg's severance, but a filing earlier this year showed he could be eligible for around $39 million. The shakeup comes as Boeing has flailed in its attempts to contain one of the biggest crises in its more than 100-year history, disrupting relationships with the very airline customers that fueled Boeing's sales boom in recent years to the pilots who have complained about broken trust. Airlines have lost millions of dollars in revenue and have curbed their own growth without access to the fuel-efficient planes, which regulators grounded in mid-March. Earlier this month, the FAA took the rare step of publicly admonishing Boeing for pushing an unrealistic timeline for the plane's return to service and for appearing to pressure the regulator. What did Muilenburg in was the repeated claims that regulators would return the plane to service in the fourth quarter and a dressing down in Washington by FAA Administrator Steve Dickson, according to people familiar with the matter. Boeing acknowledged that concerns about trust led to the change. Quote, "The board determined that a change in leadership was necessary to restore confidence in the company moving forward, and that we would proceed with a renewed commitment to full transparency, including effective and proactive communications with the FAA, other global regulators, and our customers," CFO Greg Smith, who became interim CEO, said in a note to employees announcing the changes. Boeing shares gained nearly 3% on Monday after Boeing announced the changes, but are still down 20% since the second 737 MAX crash in March. The FAA declined to comment on Muilenburg's firing, but said the agency continues to work with other international aviation safety regulators to review the proposed changes. Quote, "Our first priority is safety, and we have set no time frame for when the work will be completed," the agency said in a statement. Quote, "We expect that Boeing will support that process by focusing on the quality and timeliness of data submittals for FAA review, as well as being transparent in its relationship with the FAA as its safety regulator," it said. The resulting turmoil from the two crashes has consumed Boeing. The two crashes sparked numerous investigations, including a federal criminal probe about the aircraft's development and certification by the FAA in 2017. Earlier this month, Boeing said it would suspend production of the 737 MAX early next year, the latest sign of how the crisis is rippling through the company's supply chain. It's also sparked anger among pilots and flight attendants. Pilots, for example, weren't told about flight control software that was implicated in both crashes until the Lion airplane went down in October 2018. Quote, "No matter who's in charge, we have the same expectations and we will remain an advocate for our passengers no matter what the name tag says," said Dennis Tager, spokesman for the Allied Pilots Association, which represents roughly 15,000 American Airlines pilots, including more than 4,000 737 pilots. Quote, "Management changes alone don't rebuild trust. Actions rebuild trust." Sarah Nelson, president of the Association of Flight Attendants, which represents some 50,000 cabin crew, including United, called Muilenburg's resignation, quote, "long overdue," and blamed the plane's failures partially on pressure on Boeing to deliver returns to investors. Quote, "Safety must always come first," said Nelson. Thousands of other families are worried about their ability to provide for their loved ones. It's not right that good people on the front lines of Boeing are hurting and facing uncertainty because of failed leadership. Our members are experiencing this same uncertainty as airlines jettison flight plans." End quote. Boeing had for months resisted calls to replace Muhlenberg. The board removed him as chairman in October, saying he could better focus on bringing the MAX back to service, a process that's been delayed by additional questions from regulators. Earlier this month, the FAA's chief said he would not rule out fining Boeing for failure to make disclosures about the 737 MAX. Muhlenberg, an engineer, became CEO in 2015 and had been with the company since he was an intern. Boeing replaced the head of its commercial airplane unit, Kevin McAllister, shortly after removing Muhlenberg as chairman. Stan Deal, a 3-decade Boeing employee who most recently led its global services business, replaced McAllister. In addition to the MAX problem, Boeing suffered major embarrassment this weekend with its Starliner space capsule. Its autonomous flight control system fired at the wrong time shortly after launch, putting Starliner in the wrong orbit. A planned docking with the International Space Station to deliver supplies had to be aborted. The craft did safely return to Earth on Sunday. Calhoun's been on Boeing's board since 2009. In October, he took on the role of non-executive chairman. Calhoun has been a senior managing director at Blackstone and previously worked at General Electric for more than 2 decades, including a stint as head of its aircraft engines business. Larry Kellner, a former CEO of Continental Airlines, will become chairman. He's been on Boeing's board since 2011. Since 2010, he's been the president of a private equity firm, Emerald Creek Group. CNBC's Phil LeBeau also contributed to this report. In another great article from CNBC, who's been covering this situation really well since the beginning, their always animated Jim Cramer had some more thoughts on the matter. Also on December 23rd, by Kevin Stankiewicz, Boeing CEO had to be fired in order for the 737 MAX to get FAA certified, Jim Cramer says. Former Boeing CEO Dennis Muhlenberg had to be fired in order for the 737 MAX jet to receive regulatory approval, CNBC's Jim Cramer said on Monday. Quote, "It was impossible to get clearance with all these different entities as long as he was there, because he presided over what happened," Cramer said on Squawk on the Street. Boeing announced Muhlenberg's firing on Monday morning as the Chicago-based aviation giant struggled to regain the trust of regulators who need to certify the 737 MAX. Skipping ahead a little bit, Boeing has for months been eyeing certification by the end of 2019, and in late November it still believed the plane could return to commercial service by the end of January. But the FAA has repeatedly said it will take all the time it needs to deem the 737 MAX safe. And over the weekend, the New York Times reported on a recent tense face-to-face meeting in which the head of the FAA, Stephen Dixon, criticized Muhlenberg for putting public pressure on the agency to certify the jet. Muhlenberg also faced intense scrutiny earlier this fall during congressional testimony that Cramer called a, quote, disaster. "You simply had to get Muhlenberg out to get this process going," Cramer said. "I don't think anybody wanted to deal with him." End quote. The Mad Money host said he'd been wondering when accountability at Boeing over the fatal crashes would reach the top echelon of the company. Quote, "Someone had to pay the price, and it has to be him," Cramer said, adding that he thinks Calhoun, a former GE executive, is a strong replacement for Muhlenberg. Under Calhoun's leadership, Cramer said, the process to regain regulatory approval will be accelerated. Quote, "This plane is going to be in the air someday, but I just don't think Dennis was going to get it in the promised land," Cramer said. And shares of Boeing were up more than 2% on the news, trading around $336. A day later, on Christmas Eve, and only a day after the news came about Dennis Muhlenberg's ouster, the LA Times reports that even more disturbing information is coming to light about what happened behind the scenes during the MAX certification process that they say, quote, paints a very disturbing picture. Alan Levin and Julie Johnson write, "A new batch of messages between Boeing Company employees on the development of the 737 MAX paints a, quote, very disturbing picture, end quote, of concerns about the plane," according to an aide to a House committee. The documents were turned over to the FAA on Monday, the agency said in a statement. The disclosure came the same day Boeing ousted its chief executive. At least some of the messages were written by the same Boeing pilot whose 2016 messages were released in October and were the subject of sharp questioning by lawmakers, according to a person familiar with their contents who is not authorized to discuss them. The communications haven't been released publicly. The staff of the Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee are still reviewing the messages and have not provided specific details about what they contain. Quote, "But similar to other records previously disclosed by Boeing, the records appear to point to a very disturbing picture of both concerns expressed by Boeing employees about the company's commitment to safety and efforts by some employees to ensure Boeing's production plans were not diverted by regulators or others," a committee aide said in a statement. Quote, "The committee will continue to review these and other records provided by Boeing as part of the committee's ongoing investigation," the aide said. Boeing brought the emails to the FAA and Congress, quote, "as part of our commitment to transparency with our regulators and the oversight committees," the company said in a statement. Quote, "As with prior documents referenced by the committee, the tone and content of some of these communications does not reflect the company we are and need to be," the company said. It said it had made changes to enhance safety. The company's stock fell 1.3% to $333 on Tuesday. This was the second time the Chicago companies delayed turning over to the FAA sensitive messages related to the development of the 737 MAX jetliner, which was grounded in March after a design flaw was linked to 2 fatal crashes, one in Indonesia and one in Ethiopia. The earlier episode prompted a rebuke by the agency and helped lead to growing tensions between the regulator and the plane maker. The FAA statement didn't comment on the content of the emails, saying only that they were under review. The company's decision to turn the emails over to the FAA was reported earlier by the Seattle Times. The way Boeing handled the second set of records rankled the agency, according to a person familiar with the issue who wasn't authorized to speak about it. In recent days, Boeing told the FAA the messages existed, but it didn't initially provide them or disclose their contents, the person said. Dennis Muilenburg stepped down Monday as Boeing's chief executive, at least partly as a result of deteriorating relations with the FAA, according to a statement from the company's board. In October, Boeing disclosed to the FAA instant messages and emails by high-ranking company pilot who in 2016 expressed misgivings about the software implicated in 2 fatal crashes of the MAX that killed 346 people. Boeing had known about those messages since early in the year and turned them over to the Justice Department in February. It didn't immediately give them to the FAA because of the criminal investigation into how the plane was approved. The delay angered the FAA, which oversees Boeing. One of the agency's key tenets is that entities it oversees must disclose safety issues or possible breaches of regulations. In some circumstances, failing to tell the agency about such an issue may be considered a legal violation. Quote, the FAA finds the substance of the document concerning, the agency said in a statement October 18th. Quote, the FAA is also disappointed that Boeing did not bring this document to our attention immediately upon its discovery. The November 2016 instant messages disclosed in October were between Mark Faulkner, then Boeing's chief technical pilot for the 737, and another 737 technical pilot, Patrick Gustafson. Faulkner expressed concern that the flight control feature later implicated in the crashes was, quote, running rampant, and he said that he might have unknowingly misled the FAA about it. In separate emails he sent to an unnamed FAA official, he said he was, quote, Jedi mind-tricking regulators outside the United States into accepting Boeing's suggested training for the MAX. A lawyer for Faulkner, David Gerger, said issues raised in the messages were the result of bulky simulator software and not a result of problems with the plane itself. Faulkner believed the plane was safe and didn't mislead the FAA, Gerger said. Gerger didn't respond to requests to comment on the latest messages and whether they involved his client. At this point, I think most of you listening to the show aren't at all surprised by any of this anymore. The certification process was obviously deeply flawed, egregious mistakes were made, and we can't turn back time. But as time rolls on, we all have to confront the 2 biggest questions. First, when will it be recertified? And second, maybe even more importantly, when will we all be comfortable flying on one again? As it stands right now, I know that when the MAX does return to service, it'll probably be the most scrutinized plane in the sky. So, statistically, I guess that makes it the safest, right? Yeah, so we say that, but I know we're all struggling to feel it. And Boeing and the airlines both know a lot of us feel that way. In our next article from the New York Times, we're going to find out if a 3x5 card handout might make the difference. The article is by David Gellis, and it's called Boeing Can't Fly its 737 MAX, but it's ready to sell its safety. The company knows travelers are wary of its plane, so it's prepared presentations with strategies for airlines to help win back the public's trust. He writes, since Boeing's 737 MAX jet was grounded in March after 2 crashes killed 346 people, a question has loomed for the company. Would passengers be too scared to fly on the plane once it returned to the air? Turns out that even as Boeing continues to work on technical fixes to the plane that are needed for regulatory approval, it's repeatedly surveyed thousands of passengers around the world to try to find out the answer. The latest results from this month found that 40% of regular flyers said they'd be unwilling to fly on the MAX. So in a series of conference calls with airlines and in 40 pages of accompanying presentation materials that were reviewed by the New York Times, Boeing laid out strategies for the airlines to help win back the public's trust and convince travelers that the company's most popular plane is safe. For instance, if a traveler doesn't want to fly after buying a ticket, getting to the airport gate, or even after boarding the plane, Boeing says the airline could offer to rebook a flight, have flight attendants or pilots talk with a concerned passenger, or hand out 3x5-inch information cards detailing why the MAX is safe. Every interaction with an anxious passenger, whether face-to-face or online, is an opportunity to demonstrate our care and concern, the presentation said. This is as simple as recognition of a passenger's state of mind. Research shows that emotions drive decision-making, so a human connection will be more effective than rational appeals. End quote. In the most extreme cases, Boeing suggests using, quote, techniques related to an in-flight medical emergency to de-escalate. The calls and documents underscore the enormous challenges Boeing faces in the coming months as it tries to restore its reputation. The MAX remains grounded, and there's no timetable for when regulators will deem it safe to return to the air. In just the last week and a half, Boeing fired its chief executive and said it would temporarily shut down the factory that makes the MAX. Boeing has queried thousands of travelers around the globe 4 times since May and found that the skepticism surrounding the MAX had improved only marginally. Among the United States travelers, just 52% said they would be willing to fly on the plane, according to the survey. Quote, overall awareness of the issues surrounding the 737 MAX remains very high in all countries, Boeing wrote. The conference calls, which lasted about 30 minutes each and were held over 3 days last week, are part of Boeing's attempts to win back the trust of airlines, which have lost billions of dollars and had to cancel thousands of flights because of the MAX grounding. The effort was led by Bernard Choi, a member of the company's communications team. Some United States airline executives bristled at the presentation and materials, according to 4 people familiar with the matter, believing that Boeing has lost its credibility and that the company's involvement would only hurt their efforts to win back the trust of passengers. But dozens of airlines around the world have ordered the MAX, and many of them, especially the smaller ones, could find the materials helpful. Quote, we routinely engage with our airline customers' communication teams to seek their feedback and brief them on our latest plans. End quote, Gordon Jondro, a Boeing spokesman, said in a statement on Monday. Quote, each airline is different in their needs, so we provide a wide range of documents and assistance that they can choose to use or tailor as they see fit. Boeing has faltered badly in its public response to the crashes. The ousted chief executive, Dennis Muilenburg, who was fired Monday, repeatedly made overly optimistic projections about when the MAX might return to service, upsetting regulators and airlines. He drew the ire of lawmakers at congressional hearings where the families of crash victims winced at his name. The hiring of the top crisis communications firms, Sard Verbinnen and Edelman, did little to improve the company's reputation. On Monday, Boeing said Neil Golightly, the chief communications officer at Fiat Chrysler Automotive and a former Navy fighter pilot, would become its head of communications next year. During its presentation to airlines, the company also distributed a set of infographics, reference cards, videos, and frequently asked questions. One of the videos was an animated explanation of the new software on the MAX called MCAS, which was intended to make the plane handle more predictably, but played a role in both accidents. In the video, watermarked Draft Advanced Copy Pending Certification, a narrator explains that in the accidents, MCAS activated repeatedly after a sensor on the plane's fuselage malfunctioned, causing the airplane to crash. The video goes on to explain the changes that Boeing's making to MCAS. Quote, lives depend on the work that we do. Boeing's chief commercial pilot Jim Webb says in another video, quote, we know that when you step on board, you place your trust in us, end quote. At times, the material is startlingly self-critical. In a draft memo that Boeing prepared for airlines to share with employees, such as flight attendants, the company suggests that airlines say, quote, Boeing understands that it fell short and let us down, as well as the flying public, and it's committed to continuous improvement and learning, end quote. In another memo, Boeing says airlines could tell their pilots this, quote, we've told our Boeing partners that they did not communicate enough about MCAS, and they've heard us. Going forward, they're committed to doing a better job communicating with us, end quote. Boeing did not fully inform pilots of how MCAS functioned until after the first accident off the coast of Indonesia in October 2018. The materials also show that Boeing would try to push back on the narrative that the MAX was developed under intense deadline pressure as the company faced heated competition from its European rival, Airbus. In a draft of a frequently asked questions document intended to help airlines communicate with their employees, Boeing included the question, quote, is it true that the 737 MAX was rushed into service? Boeing suggested the airlines answer this way, quote, no. Over a 6-year period, Boeing worked through a disciplined, methodical development process that culminated with a robust test program that validated the airplane's safety and performance, end quote. In a section of the presentation focused on social media and marketing, the company said it planned to, quote, amplify any positive stories reported, and that it intended to buy ads to promote the plane's return to service. It said a company website dedicated to updates on the MAX was being designed with, quote, improved usability and, quote, stickiness to, quote, encourage more time on the site and repeat visits, end quote. These are phrases commonly used in the communications business. The presentation said Boeing's, quote, digital media team would be monitoring social conversations around the clock, end quote. The company also indicated it was preparing responses to the event that a MAX encountered difficulty after service was restarted, which could happen given that more than 500 are already built and about 5,000 have been ordered. The situations that Boeing was preparing for included engine failures or smoke in the cabin and, quote, significant events on flights by Lion Air or Ethiopian Airlines, which operated the 2 planes that crashed. In the presentation, Boeing promoted its ability to get industry analysts and some pilots to make encouraging public statements about the company. It identified dozens of aerospace trade shows at 2020 at which it planned to make its case, and it pledged to work with airlines during early flights to bolster consumer confidence, including offering to have Boeing executives on board. Quote, we know we have to work to restore confidence in Boeing and the MAX, Mr. Jondro said on Monday. We're working closely with airlines, their pilots, and flight attendants to make sure they have the information they need to provide to the traveling public to reassure them that once the certification process is complete, the MAX will be one of the safest airplanes flying today. Again, that article in the New York Times by David Gellis. Now, before I read our last article, I want to say something. I've said this before and I'll say it again. I want Boeing to succeed. I want them to come out of this MAX business stronger and better and safer than ever before. And my reading of this news isn't meant to disparage or hate on Boeing. Actually, it's quite the opposite. But the thing I just can't seem to get over is, how did this all happen? Is there a place or a point in time we can go back to that would just explain where everything went wrong? What do you think? Send me an email or record me something. Let me know where you think it all went wrong. In the meantime, though, I think the best explanation I can find is my favorite article from 2019, and it's in The Atlantic by Jerry Useem. On November 20th, he wrote, "The long-forgotten flight that sent Boeing off course. A company once driven by engineers became driven by finance. The flight that put the Boeing company on course for disaster lifted off a few hours after sunrise. It was good flying weather, temperatures in the mid-40s with a slight breeze out of the southeast. But oddly, no one knew where the 737 jetliner was headed, and the crew had prepared 3 flight plans, one to Denver, one to Dallas, and one to Chicago. In the plane's trailing vortices was Greater Seattle, where the company's famed engineering culture had taken root, where the bulk of its 40,000-plus engineers lived and worked, indeed where the jet itself had been assembled. But it was May 2001, and Boeing's leaders, CEO Phil Condit and President Harry Stonecipher, had decided it was time to put some distance between themselves and the people actually making the company's planes. How much distance? This flight, a PR stunt to end the 2-month contest for Boeing's new headquarters, would reveal the answer. Once the plane was airborne, Boeing announced it would be landing at Chicago's Midway International Airport. On the tarmac, Condit stepped out of the jet, made a brief speech, and then boarded a helicopter for an aerial tour of Boeing's new corporate home, the Morton Salt Building, a skyscraper sitting just out of the loop in downtown Chicago. Boeing's top management plus staff, roughly 500 people in all, would work here. They could see the boats plying the Chicago River and the trains rumbling over it. Condit, an opera lover, would have an easy walk to the Lyric Opera building. But the nearest Boeing commercial airplane assembly facility would be 1,700 miles away. The isolation was deliberate. Quote, "When the headquarters is located in proximity to a principal business, as ours was in Seattle, the corporate center is inevitably drawn into the day-to-day business operations," Condit explained at the time. And that statement, more than anything, captures a cardinal truth about the aerospace giant. The present 737 MAX disaster can be traced back 2 decades, to the moment Boeing's leadership decided to divorce itself from the firm's own culture. For about 80 years, Boeing basically functioned as an association of engineers. Its executives held patents, designed wings, spoke the language of engineering and safety as a mother tongue. Finance wasn't a primary language. Even Boeing's bean counters didn't act the part. As late as the mid-90s, the company's chief financial officer had minimal contact with Wall Street, and he answered colleagues' requests for basic financial data with a curt, "Tell them not to worry." By the time I visited the company for Fortune magazine in 2000, that had begun to change. In Condit's office overlooking Boeing Field were 54 white roses to celebrate the day's closing stock price. The shift had started 3 years earlier with Boeing's, quote, reverse takeover of McDonnell Douglas, so-called because it was McDonnell executives who perversely ended up in charge of the combined entity, and it was McDonnell's culture that became ascendant. Quote, "McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing with Boeing's money," went the joke around Seattle. Condit was still in charge, yes, and told me to ignore the talk that somebody had, quote, captured him and was holding him hostage in his own office. But Stonecipher was cutting a Dick Cheney-like figure, blasting the company's engineers as arrogant and spouting Harry Trumanisms like, quote, "I don't give 'em hell, I just tell the truth, and they think it's hell," when they shot back that he was the problem. McDonnell's stock price had risen 4-fold under Stonecipher as he went on a cost-cutting tear, but many analysts feared that this came at the cost of the company's future competitiveness. Quote, "There was little surprise that a guy running a failing company ended up with so much power," end quote, the former Boeing executive vice president Dick Albrecht told me at the time. Post-merger, Stonecipher brought his chainsaw to Seattle. Quote, "A passion for affordability became one of the company's new unloved slogans, as did, quote, less family, more team." It was enough to drive the white-collar engineering union, which had historically functioned as a professional debating society, into acting more like organized labor. Quote, "We weren't fighting against Boeing," one union leader told me of the 40-day strike that shut down production in 2000. Quote, "We were fighting to save Boeing." Engineers were all too happy to share such views with executives, which made for plenty of awkward encounters in the still smallish city that was Seattle in the 90s. It was, top brass felt, an undue amount of contact for executives of a modern, diversified corporation. One of the most successful engineering cultures of all time was quickly giving way to the McDonnell mindset. Another McDonnell executive had recently been elevated to chief financial officer. Quote, "A further indication of who in the hell was controlling this company," a union leader told me. That, in turn, contributed to the company's extraordinary decision to move its headquarters to Chicago, where it strangely remains in the historical capital of printing, Pullman cars, and meatpacking to this day. If Andrew Carnegie's advice, "put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that basket," had guided Boeing before, these decisions accomplished roughly the opposite. The company would put its eggs in 3 baskets, military in St. Louis, space in Long Beach, passenger jets in Seattle, and it would watch that basket from Chicago. Never mind that the majority of its revenues in real estate were and are in basket 3, or that Boeing's managers would now have the added challenge of flying all this blind, or by instrument as it were, relying on remote readouts from the situation to Chicago instead of eyeballing it directly, as good pilots are incidentally trained to do. The goal was to change Boeing's culture. And in that, Condit and Stonecipher clearly succeeded. In the next 4 years, Boeing's detail-oriented conservative culture became embroiled in a series of scandals. Its rocket division was found to be in possession of 25,000 pages of stolen Lockheed Martin documents. Its CFO, ex-McDonnell, was caught violating government procurement laws and was sent to jail. And with ethics law now front and center, Condit was forced out and replaced with Stonecipher, who promptly affirmed, quote, "When people say I changed the culture of Boeing, that was the intent, so that it's run like a business rather than a great engineering firm," end quote. A GE alum, he built a virtual replica of GE's famed Crotonville Leadership Center for Boeing managers to cycle through. And when Stonecipher had his own career-ending scandal, an affair with an employee, it was another GE alum, James McNerney, who came in from the outside to replace him. As the aerospace analyst Richard Abulafia recently told me, quote, "You had this weird combination of a distant building with a few hundred people in it and a non-engineer with no technical skills whatsoever at the helm. Even that might have worked had the commercial jet business stayed in the hands of an experienced engineer steeped in STEM disciplines, but instead McNerney installed an MBA with varied background in sales, marketing, and supply chain management," said Abulafia. Quote, "We're like, what?" The company that once didn't speak finance was now at the top, losing its ability to converse in engineering. It wasn't just technical knowledge that was lost, Abulafia said. Quote, "It was the ability to comfortably interact with an engineer who in turn feels comfortable telling you their reservations versus calling a manager more than 1,500 miles away who you know has a reputation for wanting to take your pension away. It's a different dynamic. As a recipe for disempowering engineers in particular, you couldn't come up with a better format." And in some of the internal exchanges now coming to light, you can see the level of estrangement among engineers, operators, and executives that resulted. A Boeing vice president, Mike Sinnott, told American Airlines pilots that the MCAS software system implicated in the 737 MAX crashes didn't have, quote, "a single point failure," as reported, asserting that pilots themselves constituted a second point of backup, showing both a misunderstanding of the term and a sharp break from Boeing's long-standing practice of having multiple backups for every flight system. Meanwhile, experienced Boeing engineers rolled their eyes at some software development tasks, not specific to MCAS, and they were outsourced to recent college grads, earning as little as $9 an hour, who were employed by an Indian subcontractor set up across from Seattle's Boeing field. The current Boeing CEO, Dennis Muilenburg, is being pilloried for his handling of the disaster and accused of harming the company by prioritizing profit. But the criticism misses the point, Abulafia told me. Quote, "The difference between doing MCAS right and MCAS wrong was not an economic thing. It's a culture thing. Some errors you see only with the magnifier of hindsight. Others are visible at the time, in plain sight. Quote, if in fact there's a reverse takeover with the McDonnell ethos permeating Boeing, then Boeing is doomed to mediocrity," the business scholar Jim Collins told me back in 2000. Quote, "There's one thing that made Boeing really great all the way along. They always understood that they were an engineering-driven company, not a financial-driven company. If they're no longer honoring that as their central mission, then over time, they'll just become another company," end quote. It's now clear that long before the software lost track of its plane's true bearings, Boeing lost track of his own. So there you have it. What do you think 2020 will bring for Boeing? Let me know your thoughts. Send me an email, Brandon@podcastingonaplane, or record something using your smartphone or the SpeakPipe widget that pops up each time you visit podcastingonaplane.com. While you're there, maybe consider supporting the show. If you find value in it, I'd really appreciate having you on board as a patron. You'll be in great company, and you'll join the likes of Captain Jeff, the airline pilot guy himself, RH and AG from Opposing Bases, Jamie of the Air Zoo, Muharrem Mani of the Plain English ATC communication app, and more. Plus, new patrons like Ron Horton, Evan Shue, and Lucas Worthen. Or if you're not into the recurring thing, maybe head over to buymeacoffee.com/Bravo Golf and do a one-time thing in an increment of just $3. And if you're not into financial support at all, I'll tell you what, I'd really appreciate you leaving a rating and review on whatever platform you listen to your podcast, or maybe just tell a friend. And if they don't know what a podcast is or where to listen, you can show them. And as always, I thank you so much for your support in whatever form it takes. Well, that's all for now. Your frequency change is approved until next time, and report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day.
The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brandon's comments and those of his guests, the website's content and any of the social media, etc., are not part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his, and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. Also, while he's a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI, nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie and fun, but is in no way, shape or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you're in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.
Merry Christmas, Brandon.
Merry Christmas, Candace.